Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to the Managrind tournament recap. Now, as you can tell, this is a completely different setup. It's the first time I've done a setup change in a long time when it comes to the actual tournament recaps. I did one a while back and it got fairly good feedback. And a lot of things have happened this week actually. I had this being set up, I've got the new Managrind introduction now, as you've just seen. Replaced the old one because the logo changed a while ago and it was just kind of weird to have the old introduction. But, so that happened, and then we also had a patch that just came out. Me and Moon are going to be doing a video on that this week at some point, preferably. Depends when we both have time, etc., but that is coming at some point. So be ready for that. And last thing is, I hit 1,000 subs. So as opposed to just doing some random montage video like a lot of people do when I actually hit a landmark, I am going to be doing a top decks to look out for in the new format, which we're going to be getting. We're going to be getting for most of January and most likely up until the end of February before there's another major change. So things like top decks you're going to be facing in tournaments, on ladder, what you've got to play test against, what you can play, the skeleton list of those decks, any sort of tech cards you can run. It's going to be probably a couple of videos because they're going to be fairly chunky videos. I'll do a couple videos. Probably I'll separate the tier 1 decks into one video and then some of the tier 2 decks to watch out for into a second video. And yeah, I'll do that video for people who are actually wondering how this patch is going to affect the metagame and what to play in the new one and what's not viable, what is more viable, etc. So that's a video I'm kind of looking forward to doing, and again, thank you for watching. It's been a couple of months now. I've been on YouTube for about half a year and I've got to 1,000 in about half a year, so I'm kind of pleased with that. I didn't expect it to get this popular. So thank you all. But anyway, so without further ado, let's get started with the tournament recap, shall we? Now, as you can see, I've got new formats, so I can sort of express myself and you can see me in the comment section after the video. I'd like some feedback as to whether this is good, if it's a bit clunky, anything that's a bit sketchy, because if this gets good feedback, I do prefer doing videos that people actually want to watch in a different way, and it's easier to sort of tinker with and present. So if you guys actually want to see me like this, like with these kind of videos and this kind of format, then say so. If you prefer the old one, say that. So anyway, starting again. So onto the top 4 for NA, we had I'm a Black Belt, Rizon, or Riazno, missing a letter at the end there, and then the next one we also have a missing letter, Semper Fi. I actually I spell checked myself like 4 times going over these because I kept thinking I missed a letter. And then in the second one for 3rd and 4th we had Dominic as opposed to Dominic. Dominic. So anyway, in first place we had I'm a Black Belt playing Mage Aggro. Onto the actual minions. We had the standard Blood Mage, Thalnos, Sylvanas, Tinkmaster. These are fairly standard nowadays. The Tinkmaster helps you get over taunts. Blood Mage provides card draw and spell power. Leroy Jenkins is just a fireball. It's just an extra fireball. It gives you a 3rd copy of a fireball, gives you some more burst damage. We just had some of the buff minions in Dark Iron Dwarf, getting that early buff, especially on some of the lower drops like Novice Engineer. Making it into a 3/2 is very relevant. Knife Juggler gets some extra damage out. We had a singular Argent Commander for some extra burst late game, another sort of semi-fireball, so to speak. And we also had the Black Knight, which is something which some of these decks have been running, some of them haven't been. They need some sort of removal to get over the Druid of the Claws mainly, and also Ancient of Wars. And some of the Defender of Argus targets, like Harvest Golem with Defender of Argus buff, is really hard to get over for some of these decks. So it just helps them get through the barrier, get some extra damage in, and just burn them out with the spells. Speaking of the spells, Mage Aggro decks have been varying from a lot of spells to almost no spells. But the ones that they do run, this deck is running. We have double Pyroblast, double Frostbolt, and double Fireball. We also have one Arcane Intellect to give some extra draw power late game for digging for burn. And the interesting tech from this deck is the one Ice Block. Now, the one Ice Block helps in these aggro races, and it also means that if you're playing as Rogue Cantrip, for example, you just need to stall till turn 8. So you play your Ice Block on turn 7, and they can't kill you, so you kill them on turn 8. Pretty much guaranteed. It's a very good safety net against some of the faster decks in the format. But as I said, this version was playing the least amount of spells possible. You probably cut an Arcane Intellect, but it's playing the minimum possible spells it can get away with. It's just going for the face, not dealing with board control in any way. Frostbolts will often just go straight for your opponent. You won't even bother with minions. But as we're going to see from a couple of the other mage decks that did quite well, there's the opposite ends of the spectrum. On to second place, Riazno playing Rogue Combo. This is a deck that I have not seen in months. I was so excited when I saw this deck. It's a true innovation as far as rogues go, getting this deck back into a tournament. So anyway, onto the minions. We have Blood Mage Thalnos for spell power. We also have Azure Drake for spell power and a Kobold Geomancer for spell power. All of these power some of the other spells in the deck, some of the reusable ones as we're going to go over. We also have some of the other draw power in Novice Engineers and Gadgetzan Auctioneer, which, considering the number of spells are in this deck, really does generate a massive amount of card advantage. We also have Edwin Van Cleef to combo out of those low cost drops, and we have Leroy Jenkins to do a ton of extra burst damage late game. And the two SI7s is pretty much compulsory when it comes to rogue decks in general. They're very good utility minions, help out a lot with aggro, help burst down some taunt minions a little bit faster. Very good minions. Onto the actual spells, we have 2 Blade Flurries, not something we're used to. We can run that because we have a Perdition's Blade, and it helps get some more out of your Blade Flurry with spell powers. Deadly Poison is also another way of getting a lot out of your Blade Flurry, but with Perdition's Blade and some spell power and Deadly Poison, you can hit 6 damage Blade Flurries on occasions. We also have Preparation, a card that we have not seen in competitive play since Rogue was changed. One Headcrack, another card we haven't seen in competitive play for a long time. That's why the spell power is so essential. It really does synergize well into this. We've got 2 Eviscerates for a finisher, 1 Cold Blood to synergize with Leroy Jenkins along with a Shadow Step, 2 Fan of Knives, 4 Board Wipes, 4. Rogues barely even play 2 half the time. 2 Shivs, another card which normally doesn't work, but in this kind of archetype with spells and low cost draw power with the Gadgetzan, it's just a really odd deck that I'm sure a lot of people didn't expect, and it's one of the reasons it did so well. People are not expecting this kind of deck. I would say that post-patch this might actually do okay. We're going to have to see how the metagame shifts, but it's definitely one to keep out for sort of on the lower end. Now, onto 3rd/4th place, we have Semper Fi playing a Druid beatdown deck. Now, Druid has been performing incredibly well recently, so I was sort of expecting it to do well in both tournaments. Only made it to the semis in NA at least. But anyway, so this particular Druid is playing Cenarius, which a lot of Druid decks are not playing because it's a bit slow. But in this kind of Druid deck, it works out perfectly because it's a more defensive variant. We have the standard Karen, Sylvanas, Black Knight. We have a Tinkmaster Overspark to help for the mirror matchup a lot and deal with some of the big stuff in the format. Ancient Allures helps sustain yourself with both cards and health. Defender of Argus really does buff up your taunt line. Keeper of the Grove is one of the best Druid cards in the game. Very underestimated by people playing against it, but it causes some serious damage. We've got standard Druid of the Claws with 2 Earthen Ring Farseers, which is quite uncommon. But it adds a lot of healing to the deck. Having 2 Earthen Rings and 2 Ancient of Allures means that it really doesn't matter. You're going to be healing through a lot of this burn that you're being thrown out from mages, for example. And we also have Harvest Golems and Novice Engineers, which help out a bit with the Defender of Argus, and with Druid of the Claws, just to close out the minion line. It deals a lot against these early aggro decks. They can't punch through the taunts. And on top of all of this, we have a Wild Pyromancers. Now, 2 Wild Pyromancers has become a little bit of a staple in these Druid decks recently. Some of them don't run 2, but most of them run 2. And the reason is a lot of their spells are incredibly cheap, but are lacking a bit in AoE. So the Wild Pyromancers help out a lot against AoE, deal Blood Imps, things like that. Talking about the spells, this is running probably the minimum amount of spells possible for a Druid beatdown deck, which makes the Wild Pyromancer seem rather queer, But if you think about it, you're still at a very high chance of drawing these, especially when you're digging through your deck with Lores and Novice Engineers. We've got 1 Starfall, 2 Swipes dealing with the AoE along with Wild Pyromancer, 1 Claw to deal with Fairy Dragons and other small drops or when you need some armor. Wrath is used for cycling or removing some of the early aggro drops like SI7 Agent for example, and Innervate is used to get out these really big threats like Cenarios on turn 7, Ancient Lore on turn 5 for example. Almost an essential when it comes to Druid beatdown decks. Closing out the top 4 in NA, we have Warlock Shields Up, a deck which comes up every so often, but I think is becoming more and more popular as more of the top players start playing it. Now onto the actual minions, we've got the Ancient Watcher core of Shields Up, where we have Ancient Watchers, Defenders, some Fury Protectors, but the reason the Warlock deck has been doing so well is because of the rest of the stuff it can run with the Ancient Watcher core. We've got Twilight Drake, which is always good with your hero power. We have things like the Black Knight, which you can play down, kill a taunt, and then give it taunt, and it's a massive body. Like, if you give that thing taunt, it's a 5/6 with taunt that already destroyed, say, something that gained taunt from a defender or an Ancient of War, for example. And the real heart and soul of this deck, and the reason why it gets a big punch over these other Shields Up decks, is the Giants. The ability to run a Mountain Giant and 2 Moltens consistently, while also having Lord Jaraxxus for late game, makes this deck very hard to beat, and also one of the strongest of its archetype. It's one that I would definitely keep an eye on, and with the format changing like it is with some of the nerfs that have been going out, I think it's just going to get stronger. But anyway, the spells is the more interesting bit about this particular variant of Shields Up. Now we have the standard Shadow Flame, Siphon Soul, Mortal Coils, 1 Soulfire because you don't want 2, you discard way too much of the stuff you actually need, but it's still very handy and does things other removal can't do, so you really want 1. We also have 2 Hellfires because you can't afford to run it, and it also lowers your health a bit for these giants, whereas you can't use Flame Imps like a lot of other decks would. Shadow Bolt is very good control spell in general. The interesting tech here is Twisting Nether. Now Twisting Nether, a lot of people will put it as a sideboard card, but if you're losing late game, you just Twisting Nether, get rid of the board, and then just attack him with Jaraxxus, for example. It also helps a lot against Druids, and a lot against the mirror matchup. But as I said, a lot of people would run it as a sideboard card, but Dominic was running it as main board just because he wanted to have sort of a like safe card. 1-ofs you will almost always draw with this deck. You draw through your entire deck every single game. On to the top 4 from EU. We had Spa, winning. We had Reaper, Cax, and a Bangon. Now, the top 3 of this tournament, or top 2 and then the 3rd/4th place, actually have been seen quite a bit before. They're sort of very well-known players. They've come up a lot. A Bangon I haven't seen before, so congrats for making its top 4. But anyway, first place we have Spa playing Druid Beatdown. It is kind of funny that Spa and Spo from both regions are known for Druid. But anyway, onto the minions. Now, this particular variant was playing Ragnaros for a lot of extra punch. It was playing Faceless Manipulator because it has the Ragnaros, and the Cairn gives a lot of extra win power in the end of the game. Playing 1 Earthen Ring, don't need as much in this particular variant. The Black Knight is pretty much compulsory with Tink Mastery. Helps with the mirror matchup, helps with Giants, helps against Defender Vargas, things like that. It's just 2 very good hard removal for a class that don't really have hard removal. We also have the Harvest Golems, Novice Engineers early game with Wild Pyromancers and Keeper of the Grove. And besides that, the deck is pretty standard, but the Ragnaros is the difference. Now onto the spells, we still have an almost minimum amount. The only difference between this one and the last one is that there are 2 claws in this one as opposed to 1. Now 2 claws gives you more consistently ability to deal with these early aggro decks, whereas a lot of the time when you're running only 3 of the early removal spells, being a 2-1 line with Wrath and 1 Claw, you have some issues against things like Fairy Dragons because you don't always have the Claw. In this case, you have 2 Claws, 2 Wraths, you deal with pretty much any aggro start. In this case, it was better safe than sorry, but you can always side in the Claw in a tournament like MLG. But in something like Swiss, I would probably run 2 Claws main board. Second place, we had Reaper with Mage Aggro. Now, Reaper's deck was playing a lot of the faster minions which we're used to, things like Leroy Jenkins, Argent Commander, Sylvanas, to punch through some of these taunts and bigger minions, but the rest of the core is very, very different to the one we saw in N8. This is a buff deck, very akin to the original Mage aggro deck that Moon was running when the archetype was first come up with. We have a Defender, 2 Argent Squires, 2 Dark Irons, 2 Shattered Sun Clerics, very, very buff heavy, 2 Fairy Dragons are good buff targets. A lot of the cycling through minions, and it's a very different aggro core to the other deck that was being run. As we can see with these aggro decks, there's a lot of different aggro drops you can pick from, and this one focused more on the buffs and less on sort of the value cards for each one that can just punch through damage. Like the other deck was relying on things like Knife Juggler, Sorcerer's Apprentice, 3 2-for-2s, as opposed to buffs on 1 drops and weaker 2 drops, and giving you value out of all of your cards as opposed to just punching through. Now the spells is very similar, however instead of running an Arcane Intellect, we've got 2 Arcane Missiles to buff up the mana worms a bit more. We have a second Ice Block to give more consistency to the race. Second Ice Block, again, a lot of people treat as a sideboard card, but in something like Swiss you want 2. In MOG, it's personal preference when it comes to single elimination best of 3 when you can sideboard. You either want 2 ice blocks for consistency in the first game, or you can side in the second one if you need it. Maybe you just found that he always sided it in, so there's no point in siding it out in the first place. The Arcane Missiles gives you a bit of extra dynamic against things like Blood Imp decks, other mages, gives you a bit of extra burst late game, and buffs your mana worm. Now, from one mage aggro deck to another one. This is run by Gax. Now, for an aggro deck, that's not a lot of minions. In fact, it looks like it would be the opening to a combo deck, but look more closely. We have Blood Mage and Cold Light Oracles, but the rest of the minion core, we've got Mana Worms, Leper Gnome, Sorcerer's Apprentice, Novice Engineer. These are really, really aggro minions with Loot Hoarder. Novice Engineer is played in both. But in the case of gaining board position, Novice Engineer allows you to do things like trade off with tokens without using your hero power, so you can spend your mana more efficiently on things like minions and spells. And Sorcerer's Apprentice reduces the cost on a lot of the many, many spells that this aggro deck plays. Now onto the actual spells, and I am aware that it says minions. It's my obligatory mistype. Am I ever going to make a video without a mistype? Whatever. Anyway, so onto the actual spells. We've got the Ice Block Pyroblast combo that we saw last time. We have Ice Lances, Mirror Images. This looks a lot like a control core, but the reason it's aggro is you have to look at the way it's played. We have Ice Lances used solely for burst. We have Mirror Images used solely to buff Mana Worm and also as a free way of protecting your minions. And even something like Frost Nova isn't used to delay your opponent in this deck, it's used to stop their minions from trading with your minions, so you get more damage in. It's a very interesting sort of variation on this Mage aggro deck, and a lot of people have been calling it sort of the Mage grind down deck, but it is a very, very fast deck. It relies on killing your opponent consistently on turn 8 or 9 at maximum, and using the Ice Blocks to stall out their opponent long enough to do so. So, onto the final deck from a bang on. It was another Druid Beatdown deck. Now, onto the actual minions. This one was playing a couple different variations. We have an Ancient of War in there, a Big Game Hunter, Tinkmaster, and Black Knight, so 3 different removal in minion form. We have a Ysera, because Ysera doesn't die to a lot of the stuff, it only dies to things like Tinkmaster. And on top of that, we have Fairy Dragons, giving him a bit of a better matchup against the mages. The rest of the deck, however, is very similar to something that we've already seen before, at least in this episode. Now, the spells, for a third time you notice that the spells are absolutely minimalist. There isn't even a Starfall in this one. All 3 Druid decks were running a very low spell count, running about between 8 and 10 spells. There really weren't that many spells in these Druid decks, and it shows that even when you're running things like Wild Pyromancer, you don't need that many spells to make it effective. You just need a couple, and a couple is enough. But anyway, on to the state of the metagame. Now, Druids have been dominating a lot. They've been winning half the MLG tournaments in the last month. Literally half, you can look back on it. And in a lot of other tournaments like Top Deck, they've also been winning those. They've done very well in some of the Swiss tournaments, although not as well as in single elimination, mainly because there's less of them, I've noticed. And I do think that it is the best deck in the format. I'm gonna go over the deck in general with like a skeleton and such in my actual video coming up, as it is one of the top tier decks, and I think it will stay one of the top tier decks. But I think Druid is definitely the deck to beat at the moment. It is the most consistent, it's won the most tournaments, it's played a lot on ladder. It's a very good deck. Now, some of the other stuff, we have Warlock Shields up, still coming up, but we don't have enough top players really playing it, at least in tournaments, to sort of make a notable domination in tournaments. Mage, I would say, is coming up, but when you think about it, it's actually sort of on the way out because Pyroblast was changed. So the metagame is interesting the way it's gonna go. I'll put it in my video I'm gonna do for 1,000 subs, and it's quite a complicated topic. It's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of different decks that might come up because mages were sniping a lot of these decks that they didn't have enough sustain. Like Rogue was being sniped a lot, Paladin had to run healing, otherwise they were being sniped by mages. You couldn't run things like Molten Giant Paladin, for example. Shaman midrange was also being completely sniped in tournaments and ladder by mage. So with mages sort of leaving the format with the Pyroblast change, it's gonna see a big variation in the metagame just after it's stabilized, which I think is a good time to change. Like just after it's stabilized, everything changes up. But anyway, that video will be coming out either next week or later on this week, and the patch review will be the same, either next week or later on this week, hopefully later on this week. But anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback with this whole new format, because I'm not sure whether I'll keep this one, I was just going to try it out. If you guys like it, I'll keep it. Then put it in the comment section below. If you want to come chat to me on Teamspeak, I'm at Managrind's Teamspeak pretty much all the time, whenever I'm online. And I'll put that information in the description. Anyway, as for now, this has been Jotto, signing off.